February 1944. The South Pacific sun rose through a haze of humidity, hanging low over a narrow jungle track carved from volcanic soil. Every leaf dripped with condensation, every step echoed with a muffled squelch of mud and detritus. Somewhere in the distance, artillery shells scored the horizon, sending plumes of smoke curling toward the sky, mixing with the scent of salt, sweat, and gasoline. A column of American Sherman tanks advanced slowly along the track. Their steel hulls were streaked with mud, diesel residue, and soot from previous engagements. Engines hummed and roared beneath armor plates that glinted faintly in the morning light, each one carrying a crew of men trained for mechanical survival as much as combat. Inside, soldiers shifted in their seats, hands gripping levers and triggers, eyes scanning the edges of the jungle for any sign of movement. From the dense foliage, Japanese infantry watched. Hidden among the twisted roots and vines, they crouched low, gripping satchel charges, magnetic mines, and Molotov cocktails. Every man knew the doctrine: strike the tank with fire, disable it, force the crew to abandon it, or die trying. The plan was simple, precise, and deadly, at least in theory. A crack split the air. Flames erupted along the side of a Sherman's engine deck, licking at the steel. Smoke bellowed, curling skyward, thick and black. The Japanese infantry exhaled in anticipation, ready to surge forward, confident that this was the kill. For decades of battlefield experience, fire had been final. Fire meant death. Fire meant victory. But then something unusual happened. The flames subsided almost instantly. Smoke dissipated. The engine note returned, steady and defiant. The tank's turret rotated as if nothing had occurred. The crew remained inside, calm, coordinated, continuing forward along the track. For the Japanese soldiers, it was disorienting. An assault method that had always succeeded, failing in the moment that mattered most. They hesitated, unsure whether to advance or retreat. The tanks moved on, unstoppable not because of luck, but because of a subtle innovation they had never imagined. Automatic fire suppression systems engineered into the hull. In that split second, the rules of engagement shifted. Fire no longer guaranteed victory. Panic, once predictable, had been denied. A psychological and tactical gap emerged, one that would define battles across the Pacific in ways both immediate and enduring. This was the silent revolution of armored warfare, an innovation that changed expectations, saved lives, and quietly reshaped the battlefield. And this is the story of how men, machines, and fire intersected in ways Japanese infantry could scarcely believe. By early 1944, the Pacific War had become a grinding contest of attrition, distance, and adaptation. The initial shock of Japanese expansion, Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, had long faded. In its place stood a new reality. The United States was advancing, island by island, bringing with it an industrial weight Japan could neither match nor fully counter. American strategy in the Pacific hinged on combined arms warfare. Infantry no longer advanced alone. They moved with artillery, naval gunfire, close air support, and increasingly tanks. Medium tanks, particularly the M4 Sherman, had become a central tool in U.S. operations across New Guinea, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, and soon the Marianas. This was not European tank warfare. There were no sweeping armored breakthroughs across open plains. In the Pacific, tanks crawled through jungle corridors, coral ridges, and volcanic ash. They were used as mobile bunkers, assault guns, and psychological weapons, rolling steel shields that could survive small arms fire and crush prepared positions at point-blank range. Japanese infantry doctrine had been shaped by a very different environment and industrial reality. Japan entered the war with limited armored forces and even more limited fuel supplies. Its military philosophy emphasized infantry spirit, close combat, and decisive engagement. Tanks were not the centerpiece of Japanese doctrine, the individual soldier was. When faced with enemy armor, Japanese training focused on courage, proximity, and improvisation. Anti-tank rifles, magnetic mines, satchel charges, Molotov cocktails, and explosive poles became the primary tools against Allied armor. The objective was rarely to destroy the tank outright. It was to disable it, immobilize it, force the crew to abandon it. And among all methods, fire was considered the most reliable. Fire attacked the tank's weakest element, the humans inside. Japanese field manuals and battlefield experience reinforced this belief. Early war Allied tanks, especially lighter models used by the British and Americans, were vulnerable to internal fires. Fuel lines ruptured, engines overheated, ammunition cooked off. Crews panicked, bailed out, or burned alive. A tank on fire was assumed to be a dead tank. But the American M4 Sherman represented a different design philosophy, one shaped by lessons learned quickly and corrected aggressively. The United States did not simply build tanks, it iterated them. Problems identified in North Africa or early Pacific fighting were fed back into factories within months, not years. One of the most overlooked but critical lessons involved fire. American engineers understood that a tank did not need to be penetrated to be neutralized. Heat, smoke, and flame could incapacitate a crew as effectively as a shell. As a result, U.S. armored doctrine placed unusual emphasis on survivability. not just armor thickness, but internal safety. By 1943, Sherman tanks deployed to the Pacific increasingly incorporated automatic fire suppression systems, particularly in engine compartments. These systems were not designed to make tanks invincible. They were designed to buy time, seconds that mattered when fire erupted in enclosed steel spaces. When triggered by heat or flame, these systems released fire-suppressing chemicals directly into the engine bay, smothering flames before they could spread to fuel tanks or crew compartments. In many cases, the crew might not even fully register the activation, only that the fire was suddenly gone. This was not widely known outside Allied forces. Japanese intelligence had limited access to captured American vehicles in operational condition. Field encounters, therefore, became the first exposure Japanese infantry had to these systems, and the psychological shock was immediate. The Pacific battlefield was already a place where expectations routinely collapsed. Infantry watched bunkers absorb artillery. Tanks climbed terrain thought impassable. Airstrikes came from carriers over the horizon. But nothing disrupted close-quarters anti-tank doctrine more than watching fire fail. As American armored units pushed deeper into Japanese-held territory, these moments accumulated. Small, confusing incidents where a tank should have died, but did not. Each one chipped away at assumptions that had guided Japanese infantry training since before the war began. And those assumptions would soon be tested again, under even more intense conditions, as the scale of American armored involvement continued to grow. For the Japanese infantrymen, anti-tank combat in the Pacific was a test of proximity and nerve. Training emphasized closing the distance, waiting motionless as a tank passed, then attacking from the rear or side where armor was thinner and vision limited. The act itself demanded acceptance of death. Few expected to survive the attempt. Fire was meant to make that sacrifice meaningful. When a soldier hurled a gasoline charge onto a tank's engine deck and saw flames erupt, Doctrine said the moment had succeeded. The tank was supposed to stop. The crew was supposed to panic. That expectation shaped the timing of follow-on attacks and withdrawal. When the fire vanished, it created a dangerous pause. Veteran accounts describe confusion, soldiers waiting for smoke that never came, listening for the engine to die. Instead, they heard it surge back to life. The tank did not retreat, it advanced, guns already traversing. In those seconds, infantrymen exposed themselves longer than planned. Many were killed not because they lacked courage, but because the rules they had trained under no longer applied. Inside the Sherman, fire was experienced differently. Crews knew their vehicle could burn. They smelled fuel constantly. They understood the limits of armor, but they were also trained to trust systems. When flames appeared in the engine compartment, the crew often felt heat and vibration rather than panic. The suppression system activated automatically. The fire died quickly. The tank filled briefly with chemical residue and smoke, but it remained functional. This changed behavior. Crews stayed buttoned up. They did not abandon vehicles at the first sign of fire. Gunners kept targets in sight. Drivers maintained forward motion. The tank remained a fighting unit rather than becoming a liability. That discipline, reinforced by engineering, allowed American armor to maintain momentum in environments where hesitation could cost lives. The fire suppression system's greatest impact was psychological, not mechanical. It removed one of the enemy's most reliable triggers: panic. Japanese infantry had learned that fire equaled victory against armor. When that equation failed, confidence eroded. Anti-tank teams hesitated. Attacks became less synchronized. Opportunities were missed. Conversely, American confidence increased. Tanks pressed closer to enemy lines. They supported infantry longer and more aggressively. The system created an asymmetry of expectation. One side doubting its methods, the other trusting its machine. At the tactical level, this shift altered battlefield dynamics. Tanks could operate deeper into contested terrain without fear of immediate neutralization by fire alone. Infantry advanced behind them with greater assurance. Japanese forces were forced to rely more heavily on direct hits, immobilization, or overwhelming explosives, methods that were harder to execute and required even greater sacrifice. Each failed ignition reinforced the same lesson. American tanks were not behaving as anticipated, and as these encounters accumulated across the Pacific, the gap between doctrine and reality grew wider. That gap would be exposed most clearly during moments of decisive combat, when fire, steel, and human expectation collided under maximum pressure. At the command level, the disconnect was slow to register. Japanese officers understood that American tanks were becoming more common, but many still believed their infantry methods remained valid if executed with sufficient resolve. Reports of tanks surviving fire were often attributed to poor placement of charges or individual failure rather than systemic change. Doctrine adjusted incrementally, not structurally. Orders emphasized attacking tracks, coordinating multiple explosive teams, or waiting until tanks were isolated. Yet these adaptations required time, resources, and surviving veterans, commodities Japan increasingly lacked by 1944. The assumption that fire alone could force abandonment lingered longer than battlefield reality justified. American leadership, by contrast, actively reinforced lessons learned. After-action reports highlighting fire suppression effectiveness circulated quickly. Training emphasized staying inside the tank, maintaining coordination with infantry, and trusting engineering solutions under stress. This divergence in institutional learning widened the effectiveness gap between the two forces. There was also a moral weight to these encounters. Japanese infantry assaults on tanks were often suicidal by design, framed as honorable sacrifice. When such sacrifice failed to achieve its intended effect, it carried a psychological toll beyond casualties. For American crews, surviving fire reinforced a different moral narrative that preparation, technology, and coordination could preserve life without diminishing combat effectiveness. Survival was not seen as weakness, it was a feature of the system. This contrast shaped how each side perceived the other. American tanks came to symbolize industrial inevitability. Japanese infantry, facing machines that absorb punishment without visible cost, experienced a growing sense of futility. These moral pressures accumulated quietly, engagement by engagement, until they converged during moments when entire battles hinged on whether armored momentum could be stopped. And it was during one such turning point, under conditions of extreme intensity and close combat, that the full implications of this technological disparity became impossible to ignore. June 1944, Saipan. The island was only 14 miles long, but it sat at the center of Japanese strategic defense. From its airfields, American bombers could reach the Japanese home islands. Losing Saipan was not merely a territorial setback, it was a psychological and operational catastrophe. The landings began under heavy naval bombardment, but as U.S. Marines pushed inland, resistance hardened. Japanese defenders had prepared deep, layered positions, trenches, caves, reverse-slope bunkers carved into limestone ridges. Infantry assaults stalled, casualties mounted. Tanks were ordered forward. Sherman units advanced slowly across uneven ground, exposed to artillery, mines, and close-range attacks. Japanese infantry allowed the tanks to pass, emerging from concealment to strike from behind. Explosive charges detonated. Flames erupted across engine decks and rear grills. In multiple instances, Japanese soldiers believed they had succeeded. Fires burned bright against olive-drab steel. The expectation was immediate. The tank would stop. The crew would bail out. Instead, the fires died. Automatic suppression systems activated, flooding engine compartments. Tanks slowed briefly, then resumed movement. Turrets continued to traverse. Machine guns swept the terrain where attackers hesitated, unsure whether to close again or withdraw. These moments repeated across the battlefield. For American commanders observing from forward positions, the pattern was unmistakable. Tanks that would have been neutralized earlier in the war remained operational. Momentum held. Infantry advanced behind armor that refused to collapse under methods long considered decisive. Japanese officers attempted to adapt in real time. Orders were shouted to concentrate attacks, to strike tracks, to use larger charges. But communication under bombardment was fragmented. Many anti-tank teams never received updated instructions. They acted on training that no longer matched reality. As the day progressed, the cumulative effect became visible. Sherman units penetrated defensive lines previously thought secure. Bunkers were reduced at close range. Infantry and armor remained synchronized. What had begun as isolated incidents of confusion hardened into a battlefield-wide realization. Fire alone was no longer sufficient. And as Saipan's defensive perimeter contracted, the failure of this assumption accelerated the collapse, setting the stage for a decisive phase that would permanently alter both tactical outcomes and strategic perceptions. The capture of Saipan left the island scarred, a labyrinth of cratered earth, twisted steel, and shattered bunkers. American forces had paid dearly, but the cost was mitigated by the operational reliability of their armored units. Shermans that should have been destroyed remained in service, carrying troops forward and sustaining momentum in ways that infantry alone could not have achieved. Japanese defenders, by contrast, faced a different reality. Estimates indicate that of the roughly 30,000 soldiers stationed on Saipan, over 24,000 were killed or committed suicide rather than surrender. The survivors were few, and those who lived carried the weight of having failed under methods they had been trained to trust. Close-range anti-tank tactics that had once worked with terrifying efficiency now resulted in minimal effect. Fire no longer ensured victory, it merely exposed soldiers to counterfire. Reports from American commanders emphasized the operational advantages provided by Sherman survivability. Tank crews described multiple instances where engine fires erupted after mine or explosive strikes but extinguished within moments, allowing continued engagement. Forward observers noted that infantry confidence grew in parallel. Soldiers who would have hesitated in open areas pressed forward, relying on tanks to shield them from small arms fire. Strategically, the fall of Saipan had immediate consequences. The island became a critical base for B-29 bombers striking Japan, shortening the timeline for Allied air campaigns. Japanese high command faced a profound reassessment of defensive strategies. The psychological impact of armor that could endure conditions previously considered lethal extended beyond the battlefield. Both planning and morale were affected. At a technical level, the success of automatic fire suppression validated decisions made in American tank factories years earlier. It proved that engineering solutions, even small ones like chemical extinguishers and engine compartments, could have disproportionate effects on battlefield outcomes. The U.S. Army incorporated these lessons into training and doctrine, ensuring that tank crews not only trusted their machines, but leveraged their survivability as a tactical advantage. The battle also created a gap in operational expectations. Japanese anti-tank doctrine, which heavily relied on fire as a decisive method, became less effective. Repeated exposure to tanks surviving ignition attacks eroded confidence, delayed decision-making, and increased casualties in subsequent engagements. This intersection of technology, psychology, and human behavior would continue to influence combat operations across the Pacific, from Peleliu to Leyte, and ultimately to Okinawa. Each engagement reinforced the lesson that small innovations could tilt encounters not just tactically but morally, shaping both the immediate outcome and the broader course of the war. In the humid jungles and cratered ridges of the Pacific, the survival of a Sherman tank often hinged on something invisible to the enemy, an automatic fire extinguisher. It was a small piece of engineering, almost unremarkable in isolation, yet its consequences rippled across the battlefield. A flame snuffed before it could reach the crew transformed fear into opportunity, hesitation into action, and expectation into uncertainty. For the Japanese infantry, it was disorienting. Soldiers who had trained to conquer tanks through fire now confronted machines that defied logic. Courage alone could no longer guarantee effect. Doctrines that had guided their sacrifices for years faltered. Each encounter forced a re-evaluation, not only of methods, but of what was possible under fire. Fear, once a reliable ally in tactical planning, became a source of miscalculation. For American crews, the system was reassurance. It allowed them to act decisively in moments when panic could have been fatal. Staying inside the tank was no longer just a rule. It became a strategy reinforced by engineering. Each suppressed fire was a lesson in trust, discipline, and the human-machine partnership that defined armored warfare. In a larger sense, this episode illustrates how small innovations can shape the course of war. Technology does not merely equip, it informs behavior, molds expectation, and subtly shifts the moral and psychological weight of combat. The automatic fire extinguisher did not fire a shot, yet it saved lives, preserved momentum, and quietly eroded enemy doctrine. History often records the broad strokes of war, the dates, the armies, the territorial gains and losses. It catalogs battles, tallies casualties, and analyzes strategies as if conflict could be fully understood through maps and numbers alone. Yet the true pivot points of warfare are frequently subtler, almost invisible. Small innovations, precise calculations, or technical details that escape immediate notice but ripple through the battlefield with profound effect. In the case of the Sherman tank, one such detail was the automatic fire suppression system. It was not the largest gun, nor the thickest armor, nor the most audacious maneuver that defined its impact. It was a quiet, almost unremarkable mechanism, embedded deep within the engine compartment, designed to snuff out flames before they could threaten the men inside or halt the machine's advance. For the soldiers who relied on it, this system represented more than engineering. It was a tangible reassurance, a lifeline that allowed them to act decisively in moments where panic or instinct might have dictated retreat. To the opposing infantry, it was disorienting, a sudden erasure of expectations. Fire, long trusted as the ultimate arbiter against armor, no longer guaranteed success. The predictable rhythms of combat were interrupted, and with that interruption came hesitation, doubt, and a shift in psychological balance that was as impactful as any shell fired. In those fleeting seconds when flames should have consumed both men and machine, nothing happened. The fire was gone, the tank remained operational, and the crew continued with its purpose. It was an almost imperceptible moment, yet its consequences extended far beyond the immediate scene. It exemplified how foresight, preparation, and engineering could reshape outcomes in ways that valor alone could not. Survival, when carefully designed into a system, could be as decisive as firepower, turning expectations upside down and recalibrating the moral and tactical calculus of both sides. This lesson reaches beyond a single battlefield. It reveals the profound interplay between human courage and technological insight, the ways in which tools can extend, protect, and redefine human action. War is not merely the clash of armies, it is a contest of adaptation, of subtle innovations that quietly accumulate to produce decisive advantage. The Sherman's fire suppression system stands as a testament to this principle, an unassuming device that altered the experience of battle, shaped morale, and contributed to the larger trajectory of armored warfare in the Pacific. Ultimately, the story of this innovation reminds us that history's turning points are not always found in grand maneuvers or dramatic victories. They are often hidden in plain sight, within the quiet hum of a machine performing exactly as designed. In recognizing this, we understand the true nature of armored warfare, a careful balance of human resolve, technological foresight, and the relentless tension between expectation and reality.